I'm so excited to be with you guys. I'm a philosopher, as Andy mentioned, and when Teagle reached out to me about the opportunity to participate in this program and specifically to share with you guys this story, I was totally thrilled. Notre Dame has been the beneficiary of a pretty fabulous Teagle grant that helped us with our undergraduate seminar programming here. Purdue down the street has had an awesome Teagle program that we've collaborated with quite a bit. I think the work that you guys are trying to do, introducing students to these really big ideas with texts and stories that they might love for the rest of their life, it's really, really important. And this particular text is from probably my absolute favorite collection of short stories ever, and is one of these texts I still remember the first time I read it. I was a graduate student in philosophy at Rutgers, and somebody knew I liked science fiction and told me to pick up this collection by Ted Chiang. And I just remember being gobsmacked by how intelligent this story is, but also how beautiful and how human. And I think that this is the kind of story, if you're willing to take that leap and give it to your students, you're going to have a subset of them who also realize that Ted's their favorite author and helps them think about things that they just haven't had the language to think about before. Here's what I thought we would do. I want to hit 4 beats in the next 20 minutes, and then we're going to have opportunities for Q&A and discussion. One, I want to just give you a little bit of background about Ted Chiang and his story collections. Second, I'm going to introduce you to 3 themes that I pick up on when I teach this story. There are 3 very different themes, and so you can kind of pick and choose what most speaks to you. But I'll tell you a little bit about the philosophical background of these ideas in the story and where you can find that background in the passages. Those themes are, 1, the role that the language we learn plays in shaping the thoughts that we're able to think. So we're going to talk a little bit about all the philosophy of language that's happening in this story. Second, we're going to talk about how Ted explores the theme of free will and what it means to live your life in time and to make free choices, and in particular, the free choices that Louise, the protagonist, suffers with over the course of the story. And then finally, we'll talk about the theme of parental love, and in particular, how this story explores, I think, in a very beautiful way, what it means to become a mother, and to have that kind of connection with your daughter. So there's a whole lot going on in this story. There are 3 very different kind of angles and handholds you can grab onto. I took the liberty of making a little handout for you guys, which I'm now going to put in the chat. And this is just a kind of simple Google Doc that's going to follow the format which I'm going to use. And it's got some links. And if you decide you want to go back and do a deeper dive later on, maybe a little bit of help. My one ask is that you guys use this for your own teaching aid and don't distribute it or put it on the internet. All right, so beat 1, a little bit of background of Ted Chiang in this story. And Ted Chiang, he's still a living author. He lives out in Seattle. He primarily writes short stories. He also writes nonfiction for outlets like The New Yorker on tech policy. He has a bachelor's degree from Brown, where he studied computer science, and he was a writer that fell in love with science fiction as a genre at a very young age, but he really worried that he wouldn't be able to make a career out of it. So actually, he went and worked as a technical writer for Microsoft using his CS degree for the first decade or so of his career, and began publishing short stories on the side. And Stories of Your Life is a collection of those short stories. This is the key novella that anchors that collection. And that was really his breakthrough hit. He has 2 collections of short stories. The one is that first one, Stories of Your Life and Others. Another one, which came out a few years ago, is Exhalation. I strongly recommend getting both of them and looking through them. When I teach God in the Good Life, use another one of his stories, Hell is the Absence of God, to introduce my students to the ideas of free will and religious faith. But there's just tons of material in Ted's corpus that works really well with undergraduates. A couple pro tips for reading this particular story, The Story of Your Life. 1, if you get a copy of the book, he has story notes at the end, and he has some pretty interesting insights on how he wrote this story and a deeper dive into the philosophical ideas that were inspiring him. So I didn't put this in the collection that I sent to Andy, but it's worth checking out the story notes. Second thing you should know about this story, and probably some of you guys already know this, Ted wrote this short story, Story of Your Life, it then became the inspiration for the film Arrival. And one really fantastic way of introducing students to this story is to have them read and work through the short story and then show them the Denis Villeneuve film Arrival and have them compare and contrast how the twists are handled, how the presentation of the heptapod B language changes over the course of the short story to the film, and how Amy Adams' character explores these deep questions about love and freedom. But it's totally worth showing the film. Also, if you're teaching a class that's engaging with other fiction, having students read bits of Borges, especially a Book of Ages, which gets referenced in the story. I like to pair stories like this with Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, which also gets into time and freedom questions, but there's plenty of literary references happening here. But to get into the philosophy, I'm a philosopher. That's why I love this story. There are three big philosophical debates that Ted is engaging with in Story of Your Life, at least three. He is a writer that's constantly inspired by linguistics and mathematics and physics and philosophy, and he really provides sophisticated introductions to these debates in his stories. The three that I want us to focus on is, first, the question, how does the language that we speak shape our thought? Second, what does it mean to genuinely have free will, and why does that matter? And the third big question is, what's the essence of parental love, and who's able to understand what that essence is? So those are the three, and I'll give you guys just little teasers for each of these in the discussion, and then we can have a bigger discussion about how to teach it. So theme number one that runs throughout this story, and I think was a big inspiration for Ted as he was writing it, is a debate in semantics, philosophy of language, and cognitive science over the last 50, 60 years over what's called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. You can see this on the handout. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is a hypothesis about semantics and the way language functions, and it holds basically that the language that we learn to natively speak or acquire fluency in, it not only dictates how we communicate, how we represent ideas, but it also defines the very thoughts that we're able to think and the experiences that we're able to have. So language is not just merely communicative, but it also affects your cognition. It affects the content, the ideas in your head. And I'll give you guys a really simple example, and then we'll look at how Ted talks about this in the text. So simple, and this is a hotly debated hypothesis in linguistics, but one simple example, the Mandarin language is what's called a weak tense language. It's a language where the way that you talk about time is actually very similar to the way that you talk about space. If I'm going to board a flight in an hour, I wouldn't use a strong tensed word like will. Instead, I would say something akin to, I am boarding the flight at 12:30 p.m. So you use a lot of terms like at, you locate points in time the same way you would locate points in space. English is a very, very strongly tensed language. So we use words like will or was. We don't represent the passage of time the same way we represent positions in space. And one interesting debate that philosophers in linguistics have had is, does the fact that if you grow up in a Mandarin culture, you represent time spatially, mean that you actually think about time in very different ways? And little data points, and I put a link in the handout. There's interesting data that Mandarin speakers save a whole lot more for retirement than people who speak a strong tense language like English. Is that because if you grow up speaking Mandarin, you think of time as being more real than someone who grows up speaking a strong tense language like English? That might be a kind of high level topic to hit with freshmen in this course, but you can ask them this just generally interesting philosophy question. Are there some concepts or ideas that you cannot access if you don't completely know a different language? In Story of Your Life, Ted obviously takes the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis and he puts it on steroids, and he thinks about what it would mean to come to be fluent in an alien language. And as a result of acquiring that language, the way that Louise does, you actually come to think about things in a very different way, including time itself. And so if we want to look at a passage, I'd say one of the most, the interesting references to Sapir-Whorf that we get early on in the story is around page 126, 127. And the story is reported in Louise's voice. She says, more interesting, she's learning heptapod B. She says, more interesting was the fact that heptapod B was changing the way that I thought. For me, thinking typically meant speaking in an internal voice. As we say in the trade, my thoughts were phonologically coded. My internal voice normally spoke in English, but that wasn't a requirement. The summer after my senior year in high school, I attended a total immersion program for learning Russian. And by the end of the summer, I was thinking and even dreaming in Russian. But she says it was always spoken Russian, a different language, the same mode, a voice that's speaking silently aloud. And so she introduces this idea of becoming immersed, becoming native in a language, and the different variants of that, becoming a native reader versus a native speaker. We get introduced to this idea of semigrams, which is the way the heptapod language works. By page 138, she's realizing that not only do the heptapods have different ways of representing the same concepts, like the tools that they're explaining to the humans, but also the heptapods just use language for very different purposes than humans do, partially because the heptapods experience time in different ways. So on page 138, when she talks about the nature of language for the heptapods, she says, language wasn't only for communication. It is also a form of action. According to Speech Act theory, statements like you're under arrest, or I christen this vessel, or I promise are all performative. A speaker could perform the action just by uttering the words. For such acts, knowing what would be said didn't change anything. Everyone at a wedding anticipates that the priest will say, I now pronounce you husband and wife. But until the minister actually says them, the ceremony doesn't count. With performative language, saying equals doing. And for the heptapods, all language was performative. Instead of using language to inform, they use language to actualize. And this is one of the complex points that gets into the second big theme of the story, which is how the heptapods perceive time and what time is really like and what it means to have free will in this world. So let's get into this theme. If your students are not interested in semantics and language, it's totally fine. There's still plenty to get out of this story. Another big theme that you can use in teaching this story and also works incredibly well if you're willing to show your students the film Arrival is the story is debating the nature of free will. And in particular, getting into this long-standing philosophical debate about whether or not human freedom is compatible with a deterministic physical universe. So we'll get into this very briefly. The story plays on this philosophical concept called the grandfather paradox. So, suppose that time travel is really possible. Suppose that time is actually like space. And suppose a time traveler gets in a time machine and goes back in time. And suppose further that this time traveler has free will, has the ability to make decisions, to make changes in the world. And he decides to go back in time and to kill his own grandfather. And he, in some way, alters or eliminates the very causal precursors for his own existence. Is that conceivable? I mean, this is a premise in so many time travel stories, so many time travel films. One of the background assumptions in the world that Story of Your Life occurs is that time genuinely is like space, and the heptapods are capable of perceiving the passage of time the same way we would perceive just a spread out manifold in space. So the heptapods see the future, they know the future, their language enables them to talk about the future in really direct ways. They also see the nature of things when we hear that the language of the heptapods is a language of actualization or a language that's got a telos. We know that the heptapods always see how things are going to end. They see the beginning, middle, and end, and the whole causal process just spread out before them. And as Louise learns to speak heptapod and she becomes native in heptapod, not only is she able to communicate with the aliens, but she also comes to see time in the same way that they do. She comes to see the beginning and the middle and end of everything, including some very momentous events in her life, especially the decision to conceive her daughter. So that's one piece of the puzzle, is just the nature of time, and you make this assumption that the heptapods are probably right. They have this capacity to see how time unfolds. Ted's really interested in physics, so he knows that many physicists believe that that is how time functions. It's a limit of human cognition and human language that we can't perceive to the way time works in the physical universe, but that might be how the reality of time is. More interesting, I think, is how Louise deals with the fact that she can now perceive the future, but because of the grandfather paradox, she's actually powerless to change it. So she comes to be able to perceive the future, but she can't really do anything to affect it at the risk of causing a logical paradox. And obviously, the most interesting dynamic with this story is she becomes aware when she becomes native in heptapod that she will conceive her child, that she will deeply love her child, and that her child is going to die in this very tragic accident in her early 20s. And Louise knows at each step what the future is going to hold, like what the next step in the sequence is going to be as soon as she learns heptapod, but she still participates in the sequence. She still decides to have her daughter. And we get a little bit of a gesture at the grandfather paradox on page 137 when she tells us, she's informing the reader too that, she has the capacity to see the future. She has the capacity to cooperate with it, but she doesn't have the capacity to change it. And she tells us on page 137, now that I know the future, I would never act contrary to that future, even including telling others, including her husband, what I know. So she can't. I mean, one of the heartbreaking parts of this story is when she gets to the point where she discloses to her husband after they have the daughter that the daughter will someday die, and this just breaks his heart. She says, quote, "Those who know the future don't talk about it. Those who've read the Book of Ages never admit to it." And this is getting in this really interesting puzzle. Louise now sees time the way the heptapods see time, but she's still like joyfully actually pouring herself into living her life, like raising this daughter who she knows will die, making choices that she knows are not free. They're totally predetermined, and she even knows how they will end up. But nevertheless, feeling like she's having some of the most deeply meaningful experiences of her life. So how is that possible? This is an opportunity, thinking through Louise's decision to make the baby, and the fact that she knows that her daughter is going to die, and she knows that learning about their daughter's premature death is going to destroy her marriage. She makes all of those decisions with a certain sense of like freedom and agency, but she never once has the power to change anything. And she also, in certain like phases, has to compartmentalize intellectually in a way what she knows about time, or the way she's able to think about her life. Obviously, the story of your life notion that becomes the title of this short story is ambiguous between Louise thinking and narrating the story of her of her child's life in different segments, but also the story of Louise's own life and how things unfold chronologically, but with her having this terrible knowledge. So that's a fascinating topic to pick up if your students are interested in metaphysics. If they're interested in time travel, you can bet that your students have probably read other time travel short stories, or watched films like Back to the Future. And you can compare Ted's view about what a time traveler does, which is like going along with a predetermined physical sequence of events, with other time travelers that are able to go back in time and like save their daughters, for example. So that's another theme. Final one, and then I'll open this up for all kinds of questions. Something that's incredibly beautiful about this story, and it doesn't have anything to do with semantics and doesn't have anything to do with the physics of time, is just the way that Ted captures the nature of Louise's love for her daughter over the course of the short story. And again, if you've seen the movie Arrival, it's a movie where you don't have very many dry eyes at the very end. there are interesting themes you can pick up on here and handholds to get your students talking a little bit about what it means to become a parent, and in particular, what characterizes the love that a mother has. A little bit of background. Ted does not have children. So I was at a screening of Arrival where an audience member asked him a question about how he managed to write Louise's inner life or emotional life so vividly. And he shared that, he gleaned a little bit of inspiration from a friend who was raising a newborn, but also just, tried to imaginatively think about what it would be like to be somebody who was caught in time, but going through a really significant and transformative life event, which is being a parent is such a transformative life event. And he thought that was just a really interesting kind of friction. A couple philosophical points you can bring up as you read this story and you want to explore the philosophy of parenthood and parental transformation. You have a very beautiful description from Louise's point of view of what it feels like to become a mother on page 119 and 120. And she talks about, she's recalling a memory of her daughter when her daughter was just a small toddler. And remember, she knows, and she's already told us, I think very early on in the story, she shares with us that her daughter dies. But she remembers, it'll be when you first learn to walk that I get daily demonstrations of the asymmetry in our relationship. You'll be incessantly running off somewhere, and each time you walk into a door frame or scrape your knee, the pain feels like it's my own. It is so unfair. I'm going to give birth to an animated voodoo doll of myself. One theme Ted's kind of gesturing at here, and that philosophers like Aristotle talk about and write about quite a bit, is this idea that our deepest loves, including the love that a parent has for a child, the people for whom we love are like our second self, or like Aristotle says, another self in the Nicomachean Ethics. And this is one of the reasons why love is so painful and so risky, is that when you enter into that kind of deep love with someone, you take on their pain, you take on their joys, you take on their moral risks. Like if they do something immoral, it starts to affect your sense of your own self. And if genuine love has this kind of unitive dimension, this feeling like the people that you really love are like another self, that comes with really wonderful intimacy, but it also comes with plenty of pain and danger. And Louise obviously experiences this, especially knowing that she's going to conceive this daughter who she's going to love very deeply, but then she knows the moment that she'll lose her, and there's nothing she can do about it. So that's one theme to pick up on. Another theme, and then we'll open it to questions. There's a fascinating debate that's happening in philosophy right now around the notion of transformative experiences. So I gave you a link to Lori Paul, a Yale philosopher who writes about this topic quite a bit. In brief, some philosophers think that the act of becoming a parent for the first time is an experience that not only changes how you live your day-to-day life, but it is a bit like learning heptapod B. It changes how you think and how you experience the world in ways that until you become a parent, you cannot understand. So it's literally like uploading just a new way of thinking and experiencing about the world, experiencing the world. And if that's true, if parenthood is that kind of radically transformative experience, then philosophers wonder if anyone could rationally decide to become a parent because they couldn't predict, exactly what it would feel like from the inside, or what kind of person, more importantly, they're going to be after they undergo that transformation. So that's another interesting entry point into this short story. Is, are there other kinds of experiences a human can undergo other than becoming native in a new language, which can change the very thoughts that you're able to think, the way that you process the world that you're in? And if so, are those the kinds of experiences that don't require, aliens to come down to Earth, but in fact are a more mundane part of our day-to-day lives, but we come to appreciate it in a new way by reading stories like this. So that I've gone on for about 25 minutes. We covered a lot of ground. We talked about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. We talked about the free will compatibilism debate. We talked about transformative experiences and the nature of parental love. As you can tell, there's a whole lot in this story that you can grab onto. It's very beautifully written. I really hope you kind of take the leap and think about teaching it. I think it'll inspire your students to go a lot of different directions.
Megan, thank you. I'm really grateful for the last 25 minutes, and I'm just jumping in to make the first comment and ask the first question. But after that, I hope I can recede and there'll be a Q&A with everybody on the call. I want to say, first of all, and this is not an obligatory remark, that I think what you've just done with this story is exactly the kind of teaching that we hope to nurture and encourage in Cornerstone and in uh, introductory general education courses generally, by which I mean, your focus has not been here on where does Ted Chiang's fit in literary history, or not that that's not interesting, and what are the technical features of the story. What you've done is you've brought out from the story questions that are explicit or implicit in it that are probably already on the minds of the students, but they may not have the vocabulary to articulate them, how to think about the future in its relationship to the present and the past, for example, or the question of parenthood that you concluded on. So I think that's exactly why this kind of teaching can matter, even if most of the students are rushing off into the tech fields or whatever else. So I just want to say that. Second quick comment, a little more lighthearted. Your comment about Mandarin language, which I certainly can't read or speak, but reminds me
Me
of
neither.
right, reminds me of the well-known story that Zhou Enlai at some peace conference in Paris in the 1950s or 60s was asked what was his opinion of the consequences of the French Revolution, right? And his answer was, "It's too soon to tell,"
Yeah.
which has always suggested to me that he actually did have a different conception of time than most of us have. But the third thing is slightly more, and I don't know if I can articulate this as a question. I'll try. Um, when I was reading the story and listening to you, it seems to me that what the heptapod language, the heptapod consciousness, is something like what in some theological traditions we would call God's consciousness.
Hmm.
That is, the erasure of any distinction between past, present, and future, the ability to see time as a whole, is something that human beings can't do, but God can.
Hmm.
In fact, for me, that's always been sort of close to the whole concept of what the idea of God is all about. And it occurs to me that living as we do in this age of AI, when everybody is trying to figure out what that means, that we're at a moment where we see the possibility that technology will not only match the complexity of human consciousness, but maybe even go beyond it, so that if there's enough knowledge to know all the contingent events and all the cause and effect events, you could imagine getting to the point where you can see the future
Hmm.
in a way that we can't.
Hmm.
So that's a not very clear way of putting it, but my question is, when you talk with students about this story, do you find that they have technology, more what we call AI, on the mind, and whether they find this prospect attractive or they find this prospect frightening or some of both?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. So we'll talk about determinism and then let's talk about how we feel about it. Uh philosophers have typically said that we would know we lived in a deterministic universe, or we would experience a deterministic universe, if we could know the initial conditions and know all the laws that describe how particles move through that, how and objects move through that. If we knew both of those things, we would know everything. We'd know what Andy's going to eat for lunch. We'd know exactly the moment of Lonnie's death. We would know who would win the next presidential election because we just predict which set of particles are going to be on the dais in the Capitol in like this time period. If we had that knowledge, we would know everything. And so it doesn't even matter if time is spread out like space. We would just know the answer to every single question that right now is uncertain to us about the future. And you might think, I'm in San Francisco right now. Every single ad surrounding me in this airport is about a new artificial intelligence product that I should download or use. You might think that the essence of this new data era is we can know everything about the world as it currently is. Like we can collect data on the location of every single one of us, on every single dollar being traded in every single market. Like anything that human beings could possibly be curious about, we can know with some level of certainty where it is right now. And if we could couple that with knowing where it's going to move and the laws, how the laws of economics, the laws of physics, et cetera, are going to push it, then we would literally know everything. There would be no mystery to the future at all for any of us. That doesn't require time travel. That just requires this a sort of complete control over knowledge. And that's certainly what the era of data is trying to do for us, is give us control, give us the ability to predict with high levels of accuracy things that seemed like magic to pre-industrial people. And Ted's certainly thinking about those questions. And if you read, certainly the stories you read in Exhalation, he plays on those ideas a lot more. I don't know how many of your students would have read Slaughterhouse-Five, but that's one of my, I like to put passages of Slaughterhouse-Five in front of students when they think about how determinism would affect them if we got to this point. Slaughterhouse-Five famously also has aliens in it, and the aliens see all of human history just by looking. Like they have these weird eyes and they can just look and see any part of human history, past, present, or future. And the main character, who's totally traumatized by his experience at World War II and is like suffering very greatly because of his experience at war, which is, by the way, also a transformative experience for people like Lori. The main character asks the aliens, how do they handle things like the Holocaust? Like if they're just always there being like looked at and known and seeing them, and you could ask the same thing of God. Like, how does God, he's omniscient, look at things like 1944 in Germany and Poland? And the aliens say like that bit of time is always there. We just choose not to look at it. We just choose not to pay attention to it. Like we know that information is there. We could access it if we wanted to, but to enjoy our lives, we just turn it off. We ignore it. And that raises interesting questions about living in a world of very accurate prediction, in a world of artificial intelligence, is whether or not humans might want to get to the point where we are able to know some things, but we don't want to because it would crush us or disturb our well-being. And clearly that kind of compartmentalization is happening with Louise and her daughter in the story as well. Like when she's fighting with her teenage daughter, there's a part of her mind that is aware that she'll lose her and that she'll die, but she still lives in the moment of just getting angry and experiencing the fight and moving on. And how we may become, as we become more powerful people with much more control and capacity to predict, maybe we're going to also start to engage in that same compartmentalization.
That's great. That's great. Thank you. It makes me feel it would be a great experience to be in your class. But let me stop talking and Lonnie, do we have some questions coming in? Yeah, Lonnie, you're muted. Sorry.
Sorry, thank you. Yes, we're starting to receive some really wonderful questions. And, I'm going to start by kind of trying to summarize questions. Folks, please keep them coming. I'm going to try to summarize your questions for Megan, and also when I see similar questions, I will sort of concatenate them. Okay, so, questions around like how like Megan, you talked about how you bring your experience as a philosopher to teaching this text. And so for those of us who don't have that background and are teaching from, in a different sort of disciplinary context, how do you talk about, how do you kind of break down talking about time?
Yeah, and this is I did my dissertation on philosophy of time before I switched over into more of the ethics stuff. So don't first bit of advice, don't be afraid. Like you're not going to screw it up. Philosophy has been going for 2,500 years. especially in gen ed courses, as long as you have like a fun puzzle to put in front of students and you kind of open it up, the discussion is the goal in teaching philosophy. Like the dialogue is the goal. Don't worry about like misrepresenting the definition of a particular term, things like that in gen ed. Don't worry about it. When I try to teach like paradoxes of free will, usually where I start with students is I'll go around and say, what's like a big decision you've made recently that kind of weighed on you quite a bit and you thought quite a bit about it? And I'll get answers like, oh, the decision of where to go to college or the decision of whether to break up with someone. And I say, okay, like think about the feeling of like of making that decision and resolving it and owning it. Now imagine that you could have never chosen otherwise. Like it was destined from the moment you were born that you were going to go to Notre Dame, and not in a like, rah rah way, but like literally you worried so much about that decision and it didn't matter because it was inevitable that you were going to end up here. It was inevitable that that breakup was going to happen. Sorry, there's some big sports thing happening behind the scenes if you hear those guys yelling. So having them have the first experience of like, what does it mean to have freedom to make a decision, to feel like this came from me and my agency? And then how weird would that be if you didn't actually have a choice? And getting them to just care about that. And then say, okay, if every aspect of the future is already predetermined, it could be known by aliens, by God, would that, like, how would you feel if you came to learn that? Would it change anything about your memory of making that big decision? Or would you be totally fine with it? And I'll usually, 50-50 hands will go up on different sides of whether they would care. And then you help the students map, okay, the people who wouldn't care so much, you guys are compatibilists. You think of like free decisions and morally significant decisions are totally compatible with living in a world where everything in the future is totally determined. And the people who didn't want to raise their hands, you guys are incompatibilists. You think there's something weird about this. And then you go back to the story. Louise learns that she can't change anything about the future. Once she learns heptapod B, she knows the future and she knows that she can't change it. So determinism is true in Louise's world. Is she a compatibilist or an incompatibilist? Like which side class would she, which team would you think she would go into? And there they might have to do some detective work. It turns out she's probably a very serious compatibilist. She still lives her life. She still takes joy in having her child. She still, suffers the pain of divorce. The knowing the future doesn't like numb her or turn off her ability to find meaning in her life. Quite the opposite. She finds the experience of becoming a mother extraordinarily meaningful. And so that's a class session. That's probably, a 45-minute class session right there, just getting the students from they care and they have a debate amongst themselves about freedom. Ted has a position on this, and Ted creates this woman who's more on the compatibilist side. So I think you do want to start. I usually try to start with students realizing they already have a philosophical commitment. And again, knowing just a little bit about the debate is enough for you to think of a prompt to have the students realize how it's affecting them, and then try to diagnose the character. I'd say with the linguistic, the hardest thing, I did these in order of difficulty, I think, for which themes to pull out in a freshman class. Probably the hardest thing is teaching them about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. If they're just if they're not curious about how language works, that one might be trickier, but you kind of got to read the room. And I sometimes students are very excited to be introduced to a concept that they've just never heard about before, like the thought that a linguist might get to the bottom of the fact that some people not only disagree about politics and culture, but they literally are programmed to think differently about how they even experience the world because of what language they speak. And if that's true, then also our differences run way deeper than culture. And that's a kind of startling outcome of Sapir-Whorf being true.
Thank you. Okay, so there are some really wonderful questions from faculty at this workshop who are either teaching Ted Chiang now or are developing courses where they expect to incorporate his readings. And so, questions around how to teach the text alongside the film, which we spoke about,
Yeah.
maybe a little bit more. And also questions about pairing the Chiang text with other texts. So for example, Derrida and Kuhn have been mentioned.
Yeah.
also
Yeah.
see Abbott's Flatland,
Yep.
Octavia Butler's Bloodchild series. And just more generally, sort of the role of what you're observing when it comes to teaching science fiction
Mm-hmm.
in the humanities classrooms, particularly
Yeah.
in first-year general education classrooms. I'll just say, looking at sort of cornerstone proposals to circulated with Teagle staff, to me, it definitely seems like there's growing interest in using science fiction to
Mm-hmm.
engage young people. Um, and so, I'm just wondering, does that kind of comport with your own experience?
Yeah.
Students, what you're
So
doing. So if you could talk about just generally opportunities that you're seeing.
yes. So these are great suggestions. Let's talk about pairing with other texts first, and then let's talk about the film. I will strongly recommend that you show them the film after you have them read the short story, because they're just fabulous. On texts, I should have put this in the document. Maybe I'll go in and add it when I get off this call. There's a wonderful philosopher named David Lewis who has this very accessible short essay called The Paradoxes of Time Travel, which explains the grandfather paradox and also explains how you could experience the passage of time even in a world where you couldn't change it, where you couldn't change anything about the past. He kind of explains in a little bit more depth what it'd be like to think of time in a way that is clearly the way time is working in Louise's world. So that's a great paper, and also for you to read if you just want like quick way to learn how to explain the philosophy of time travel and the grandfather's paradox. And Lewis is one of the best philosophers that writes about philosophy of time. Totally great article, and I'll drop that in the document when I get off the call, or at least the link to it. Flatland is great. It's a short story that it's a novella that exposes students to how to imagine what it would be like to think of time as just another spatial dimension, or the same way that we ordinarily think about space. So if you want to go a slightly more physicsy engagement route, Flatland is a good way to do it, because it helps students just develop conceptual resources to try to think about time in that way. It's probably a bit more of a stretch for this story, because this story doesn't talk that much about the nature of time itself, except Ted's going to give you just enough to realize that Louise knows everything about the future. That's the most important hook he needs to give you, and it's somewhat physically serious. And then he wants to talk about Louise the whole time. So Flatland might be overkill and really teaching your students how to think about what's called the B theory of time, the spatial view of time. But that's certainly great. I think if you wanted to use Thomas Kuhn, can be hard to read, but the Scientific Revolutions book, if you found really great passages of that to pair with some of the discussion of Sapir-Whorf, that could be really interesting. This idea that, I don't know how much, it's been a while since I've read Kuhn, but how much he talks about language itself as a tool for constructing theories. I'm sure Chiang has read Kuhn, so that could be a good connection. But probably David Lewis I'll put this David Lewis article in. That'll be the most direct hit for getting students to think about time and what are called closed causal loops, like time travelers, people who are able to intellectually time travel, like the way Louise is able to bounce now around in time, or people who are able to physically relocate to a different part of space-time, all the paradoxes of assuming that that's physically possible. The Lewis article hits really well. With the film, and I've got an amazing colleague, I'd be remiss to not mention him, Jim Collins at Notre Dame, who oftentimes teaches this story. He's a film professor. He teaches the story of your life and then teaches the film. I've learned a lot about how to approach this from him. There are some really interesting disanalogies between the short story and the film, which make it hard to decide, I guess, which order you teach them in. The short story gives away that the daughter dies pretty early on, like you're about a third of the way in when you learn about the death. The film holds on to that till actually pretty late in the film, and it's a real body blow to the audience when you put the pieces together that the daughter's dying and Louise, Amy Adams' character, knows this. So some of it is where you want your students to get the emotional punch. The film hits you way harder with it. The film adds this deep storyline about diplomacy, international diplomacy, around trying to figure out how to get the humans to cooperate with the aliens. And there's a little bit of that in the short story. One of the linguistic ideas that Ted talks about is like, to learn a language, you need a cooperative teacher. Like, you need somebody who's willing to help solve some of the really difficult problems of reference and establishing common reference early on, so that then you can start to piece together the puzzle that is their foreign language. So that requires cooperation. And he explores that theme a little bit. The film like makes that a much bigger plot line. And so if you want to talk about the fact that like languages require social trust, and learning a new language requires certain kinds of like generosity on the part of the person that's teaching it to you, and that could fall apart if people, depending on human nature. The film explores that in like way more detail than the short story does. The short story just kind of glimmers at it. I think one of the most interesting things about the film is just beautifully shot, and you have to imagine Heptapod B when you read the story, and it can be really hard in the middle of this short story to really figure out what Ted is talking about when he talks about the semigrams and he talks about how the language works. One of the things that's incredible about the film and the way it's shot is, that takes that cognitive load off of you. You get to see the actually beautiful renditions of the language and how it unfolds over time, and you're able to visualize it. And so for some students, that might also help them quite a bit. The things that are nice about the story compared with the film is how, how Louise is talking to you directly and not afraid to get into some of the like details about she's a linguist. She's teaching you a little bit of linguistics as you go. Gary's a physicist. They're teaching you bits of physics as they go. So there's more depth in the story than is at all capable of capturing in the film. And I think I guess I prefer the story to the film, mostly because I think the story is far more intriguing when the daughter's gonna die early on, and then it's like absolutely beautiful watching how Louise lives her life and reasons through that. Whereas, you gotta, once you watch Arrival for the first time and you learn the twist, then you got to go back and watch the whole thing again to ask yourself how Amy Adams has lived her life knowing this. And so the story, you get the whole thing on the first go, and the movie you got to watch twice.
And just as a sort of practical matter, how, and maybe this is just an artifact of how long your class sessions are. When do you screen the movie in full during class, or do you ask your students to watch it outside of class and come prepared to talk about it?
We've had them do it outside of class, and it's been a minute since I've taught this story, but our library at Notre Dame will allow you to put films on reserve, so students can just go like log in and watch it. I think a couple times we've done it outside of class, or we've also done it for faculty groups where we've shown a screening outside of class and just got a classroom with a nice sound system and had people watch it together. There's definitely something about watching a film together that students are going to enjoy it a whole lot more if you enable that outside. But yeah, I think Arrival, unless you have a 3-hour, 2.5-hour class, it'd be a bad movie to interrupt halfway through and then start up again the second class, because it's building in this. It's such an emotional film. It's building on this emotional storyline. I'd want them to watch it in one go. And then when you teach it, and my colleague Jim is fabulous on this, then you want to focus in on particular clips the same way you focus in on particular passages of the short story. So the scene of the family in the hospital, the very first time you see the semigram written out, there are times where Amy Adams' character speaks about free will, or you see her and Gary kind of staring off into the distance, and he's thinking about how open the future is, and they're in the truck bed, and she's thinking about how fixed it is. And so being able to show clips back in class the same way you'd use passages is pretty important. And that's not, with timestamps and such, that's not that hard.
Well, there's a comment here, a comment and a question
Mhm.
about a specific sentence that you called our attention to in your talk, and also it's in the excerpt that we've linked to.
Mhm.
Those who've read the Book of Ages never admit to it, right? It's such a powerful line.
Yeah.
So, the comment is, that's not Louise's attitude in the film. It ends with her lecturing on Heptatod B.
Yeah.
Have you considered this set of questions in discussing the story, especially in a class on politics? Are there
Yeah.
philosophers or scientists or even mystics that it would be dangerous for society to be exposed to? How do we weigh the balance between knowledge and social peace and stability, right? Like this
Oh,
is a
yeah.
big question.
That's a fabulous question. I don't have too much to add other than I don't know if I can like or like double click that question. I mean, for Ted, clearly, and in the film, language is a tool. Language is a technology that the aliens give us, like, and it's a very, very powerful one. Literally the power to see the future. It's a language that they give to Louise that enables her to have a power many people in human history have like totally loved. I don't know why, Louise doesn't start betting on the stock market because she doesn't have free will, but many people would like love to have this power to control and know the future. So thinking about language as a tool and a tool that could be used for various good or bad outcomes. The film does not go as deep into the free will aspects of this as the short story does. And that's a very prescient observation on the part of the questioner of like the film at the end, why audience members aren't screaming like don't teach undergraduates how to know the future. That's going to one potentially ruin their lives if they're incompatibilists. But two, like this is a very, very, very powerful tool. You should want to be very, very careful who has it. I think it's a great point. I hadn't thought about that. That is a wacky way that the film ends. What are I guess humans and in the future after the heptapods come are capable of handling this in a way that I would not be.
Are there other Chiang stories that you like to teach in other courses?
Yes. And I didn't bring my collections with me. There are two short story collections, The Story of Your Life and Others and Exhalation. And they are fabulous. And you got some stories that are like 3 pages that are just a really nefarious puzzle about free will. And then you've got some that are novellas like this, which are longer, like definitely meatier. I absolutely love teaching Hell is the Absence of God, and that's what I often use in God and the Good Life, which is a short story that Ted wrote. It's in the Stories of Your Life collection. And he basically starts with this premise that we live in a world where heaven and hell exist and where everyone on earth can see who ends up where. But like God's decisions are still like kind of random and inexplicable, especially decisions about like maiming people and killing people. Um, and the main character wrestles with this puzzle of his wife is killed very unexpectedly and also unexpectedly ends up in heaven, and the main character despises God for killing his wife, but wants to be with his wife because he loves her very deeply, and so he's trying to trick his way or figure out a way to get to heaven without respecting the God that killed her. And it's just for in a Catholic context, like, well, I want my students to talk about the problem of evil and how the problem of evil doesn't necessarily go away, even if you knew, if you were able to predict God's behavior or see what God was doing, that's not going to take the problem away. It's just a great discussion point. It's got this vicious ending, which I won't ruin for you guys, but it's just a beautiful, really cool, funky story. In Exhalation, if you're teaching a course on technology ethics, there's a novella in Exhalation called The Life Cycle of Software Objects that read it before you assign it, because it gets into pretty much every like morally problematic thing that can happen as we create artificial intelligence in the form of these cute little AI animals that just terrible things happen to. And again, don't want to ruin it for you. But that story is fabulous of thinking like technology starts from here. If we get the capacity to do this, here are all the moral questions that are going to open up. And it also raises a theme that Ted writes about in his nonfiction quite a bit, namely the terrible way that modern capitalism distorts the ethical use of technology. And capitalism's the real villain in that story, and it like creates the preconditions for terrible things to happen. But that's a really fun one to read in the era of chatbots and us trying to create artificial companions. That story just goes through all the different twists and turns of that, and it holds up. Like the technological predictions Ted was making are still make sense in 2025. So I love that one. those would be my two big recommendations. Hell is the Absence of God and Life Cycle of Software Objects are like, they're just gold mines. There's ton, the like story of your life. There's so much going on.